been driving for hours, her car tires crunching over the snow-covered road as she made her way to Frosthaven. The town was small, nestled deep in the mountains, and she had heard little about it other than a few mysterious stories from the locals in the city. She needed to leave everything behind, and this quiet, isolated place seemed like the perfect spot to start over. The moment she arrived, she was greeted by Mr. Thornton, the innkeeper. He was an older man, with gray hair and a rough voice, but his welcome was warm. "You'll be staying for the winter then?" he asked as he handed her the room key. "Just for a few months," Emma replied, trying to smile. She didn't want to talk about the real reason she came to Frosthaven. She just needed peace. The inn was old and creaky, with heavy wooden beams and the smell of pinewood in the air. The fire in the hearth crackled, casting flickering shadows across the walls. Mr. Thornton showed her to her room, and as he left, he gave her a strange look. "Make sure you stay inside when the snow starts falling. It gets dangerous out there." Emma raised an eyebrow, but didn't ask him what he meant. She was already used to hearing strange warnings. She'd heard them everywhere she went. "Thanks," she said, closing the door behind her. As the snow began to fall heavily outside, Emma felt a strange shiver run down her spine. It was as though the very coldness of the place seeped into her bones. She shook it off, sat by the window, and watched the snowflakes dance in the wind. The next day, Emma explored the town of Frosthaven. The streets were empty, the buildings old but well kept. A few villagers waved at her as she passed by, their faces hidden behind thick scarves. Most of them seemed to avoid eye contact. At a small coffee shop, she met Sarah, a woman about her age who smiled brightly and invited her to sit with her. They exchanged pleasantries, and Emma was relieved to find someone friendly in such a quiet town. "You're new here, huh?" Sarah asked, stirring her coffee. "You won't find much excitement in Frosthaven. It's peaceful, but it has its secret." Emma leaned forward. "Secrets? What kind of secret?" Sarah's smile faded slightly. "You'll hear about them sooner or later. About the Wraith, the spirit that haunts the forest outside town. People say it comes every winter, and it's hungry." Emma laughed nervously. "A spirit? Are you serious?" Sarah nodded. "Serious enough that the townsfolk don't go into the woods when the snow gets heavy. The Wraith has claimed lives before, and it will again." Emma felt uneasy, but she didn't want to appear too scared. "Well, I'm just here to rest. I won't be wandering in the woods anytime soon." Sarah smiled again, though there was a hint of sadness in her eyes. "That's good. Stay inside when the storm comes. It's not safe out there." That night, the storm hit harder than expected. Snow whipped against the windows of the inn, and the wind howled through the cracks in the old wooden walls. Emma wrapped herself in a blanket by the fire, trying to enjoy the warmth. But the howling wind kept her on edge. The storm seemed unnatural, as though it carried something with it. She tried to ignore the strange sounds from outside, the scratching and tapping on the windows. Maybe it was just the wind. Maybe it was just her nerves. She closed her eyes and tried to sleep, but the coldness of the night wouldn't let her. Something was out there, watching. The storm raged on through the night, its howl so deafening that it felt as though the walls of the inn might be torn apart. Emma barely slept, tossing and turning in her bed, hearing strange noises outside. There was a low scratching sound at the window, followed by a faint whisper that seemed to call her name. Her heart raced, and she clutched the blanket tighter around her shoulders. Was it the wind, or something more? When she awoke the next morning, the storm had finally subsided. The sun struggled to break through the clouds, casting a cold, pale light over the snow-covered town. As Emma stepped outside, she noticed something unsettling. The streets were eerily silent. No one was in sight, no one except Sarah, who was walking briskly toward her. "Did you sleep all right?" Sarah asked, her eyes darting nervously to the horizon. Emma hesitated. I'm not sure. I heard some strange noises last night. It felt like something was..." Sarah's face hardened. "There's something in these woods, Emma. It's not just a story, it's real." Before Emma could respond, a shout echoed from the distance. It was coming from the edge of the town. Sarah stiffened and looked over at Emma, her expression grim. "It's him," Sarah muttered. They both hurried toward the noise, arriving at the town square just as a group of villagers gathered around something on the ground. Emma's stomach twisted as she saw the body, Jacob, the local blacksmith, lay frozen in the snow. His face was pale, his body stiff, as if he had been turned to ice. The villagers stood around in stunned silence, though none seemed particularly surprised. Some whispered quietly among themselves, while others shook their heads in resigned acceptance. "Not again," Mr. Thornton said softly as he walked past, his eyes glinting with something Emma couldn't quite place. Sarah gripped Emma's arm tightly. "This happens every year. Someone gets taken by the wraith. It's the price we pay for living." "But he was just out for a walk," Emma said, her voice trembling. "How could this happen?" Sarah's voice was low and full of dread. "The wraith waits for the storm to pass. It doesn't take anyone who's prepared. If you're caught out there, it's too late." The villagers quickly began to carry Jacob's body away, and the group dispersed, but the eerie silence that followed hung in the air like a heavy cloud. Emma couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible was coming. The days grew colder, and the snowfall didn't stop. It seemed as though the storm was never going to end. Emma spent most of her time in the inn, trying to keep warm, but the unease gnawed at her. She couldn't get the image of Jacob's frozen body out of her mind. That night, as the wind howled outside, Emma sat by the fire in the inn's common room. Mr. Thornton came over to her, his expression more serious than she had ever seen it before. "You're not from here, Emma," he said softly, "and I know you're curious. But some things are better left unknown." Emma frowned. "What do you mean?" Mr. Thornton leaned in closer, his voice barely above a whisper. "The wraith is not a spirit, not in the way people think. It was once a man, one of the first settlers of this town. He made a deal with something dark in the forest, and now, every winter, it comes back to claim those who wander too far. The wraith feeds on the cold, and on souls." Emma felt a chill run down her spine. "So Jacob, he was taken by the wraith?" Mr. Thornton nodded gravely. "Yes, and you're here too now. You'll need to be careful or you'll be next. The wraith does not forgive. It waits for you to make a mistake." Emma wanted to protest, to call him mad, but there was something about his voice that made her pause. Something in his eyes told her that he wasn't joking. "Stay inside at night," he added, "and don't go near the woods. I've seen it before, and I don't want to see it again." The days continued to drag on, each colder than the last. Emma's paranoia grew. Every time she left the inn, she found herself looking over her shoulder, half expecting to see something or someone lurking in the shadows. The whispers in the wind grew louder, more insistent. At night, she heard strange sounds, like the creaking of old trees and the soft scrape of icy fingers against the walls. One evening, Emma stood by the window in her room, gazing out at the snowy landscape. The moon was high in the sky, casting a cold silver light over the village. Suddenly she saw it, just at the edge of the forest, a faint figure standing motionless, watching her. Her breath caught in her throat. It was a shadow, tall and thin, with eyes that glowed faintly in the darkness. It didn't move, but it felt as though it was staring directly at her, as though it knew she was watching. The figure vanished as quickly as it had appeared, but the fear it instilled in Emma lingered. She backed away from the window, her heart pounding. Was it the wraith, or was it just her imagination playing tricks on her? No matter what it was, she couldn't ignore the feeling that she had been marked. The wraith knew she was here, and it wouldn't stop until it happened. That night, Emma couldn't sleep. She tossed and turned, the sounds of the wind outside growing louder, until it felt like the very walls of the inn were shaking. Her restlessness grew unbearable, and she decided to go downstairs for some water. As she stepped into the common room, she froze. The temperature had dropped drastically, and the room was unnaturally cold. The fire in the hearth had gone out, leaving only faint embers behind. The wind outside howled, but the silence inside the inn was suffocating. Suddenly she heard it, a soft whisper, just at the edge of her hearing. Her name, Emma. She turned, but there was no one there. The voice had come from the doorway, though the figure that stood there was barely visible in the shadows. As her eyes adjusted, Emma's breath caught in her throat. It was the same figure she had seen outside earlier, tall, thin, with eyes that burned like ice. The wraith was here. Emma's heart hammered in her chest, and she backed away, but the figure advanced. Its face was pale, its features twisted and frozen. It was the face of a man who had long since died, his flesh frozen in an eternal grimace. "Leave. Now," it whispered. its voice like the sound of cracking ice. Before Emma could react, the figure lunged toward her and her world went black. When Emma regained consciousness, she was back in her room, lying in her bed, her body trembling from the cold. The wind was still howling outside, but there was no sign of the wraith. She sat up, panic rising in her chest. What had happened? Was it real, or was it just a nightmare? Sarah burst through the door, her face pale with fear. "Emma, are you all right? We need to get out of here. It's too dangerous. The wraith is coming for you." Emma stood shakily, trying to gather her thoughts. It was real, wasn't it? The wraith. It was here. Sarah nodded. "Yes. And it's not done with you yet. We need to go to the forest. There's a way to stop it, but we have to hurry." Emma knew it was a risk, but the alternative was worse. If she stayed, the wraith would claim her next. Sarah led Emma through the snow-covered streets toward the edge of the forest. The night was silent except for the wind, which seemed to carry an unsettling weight. As they entered the woods, the temperature dropped even further, and Emma felt her body begin to freeze. There's a stone," Sarah said, her voice urgent. "We need to find the sacred stone, and if we do the ritual right, we can stop." Emma's heart raced as they ventured deeper into the forest, the moonlight barely cutting through the dense trees. Suddenly, she felt the hairs on the back of her neck stand up. The wraith was close. It had found them. The forest was suffocating in its silence, save for the crunch of snow beneath Emma's boots and the occasional rustle of the wind through the bare branches above. Each step felt heavier, as though the very air itself was trying to weigh her down. Emma could feel the cold creeping into her bones, but it wasn't the natural chill of winter. It was something deeper, something darker. She knew the wraith was near. Sarah moved ahead of her, her breath visible in the frosty air, her eyes scanning the snow-covered ground. "We're close," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "The stone should be just up ahead." Emma nodded, though she was hardly listening. She was too focused on the strange feeling of being watched, the weight of the air thick with unseen eyes. The snow seemed to grow deeper the farther they walked, as if the forest itself was trying to keep them from going in. Suddenly, Emma stumbled, her foot catching on something hidden beneath the snow. She cried out and fell forward, her hands sinking into the icy ground. As she pushed herself up, she saw it, a faint shape in the snow, just below the surface. With trembling hands, she began to clear away the snow, uncovering a large, smooth stone, covered in strange symbols. "This is it," Sarah breathed, her voice filled with awe. "The sacred stone." The stone was unlike anything Emma had ever seen. It was large, almost like a small boulder, but it was perfectly smooth, and its surface was covered in ancient runes that seemed to shimmer faintly in the pale light. The air around it felt unnaturally cold, and Emma shuddered as she touched it, a jolt of ice running through her fingers. But before she could ask any questions, a shadow moved in the trees behind them. Emma turned quickly, her heart skipping a beat. The wraith was there, standing at the edge of the clearing. Its icy blue eyes gleamed in the darkness, and its face twisted in an expression of hunger. It had followed them, waiting for the right moment to strike. "Leave the stone," the wraith hissed, its voice like the cracking of ice. "It belongs to me." Sarah stepped forward, her face grim. "We're not leaving. Not this time." The wraith's form shimmered and flickered, as though it was made of the very cold air itself. Its presence seemed to bend the space around it, distorting the shadows and the snow. Emma's breath caught in her throat as she realized how powerful it truly was, how close it was to finishing its curse. "You cannot stop me," the wraith whispered. "I will claim your souls, one by one." Emma's mind raced as the wraith advanced toward them, its form becoming more solid with each step. She could feel the cold in her lungs, the air around them growing frigid as though the temperature was dropping even further. Her heart pounded in her chest. She had to do something. "Sarah, what do we do?" Emma gasped, her voice shaking with fear. Sarah's eyes were wide with urgency. "We need to perform the ritual," she said. "Quick." She knelt beside the stone, her fingers tracing the runes carved into its surface. "We have to chant the words, and we have to make a sacrifice. Only then will the curse be broken." Emma felt a deep sense of dread wash over her. "A sacrifice?" she whispered. "Sir." "Yes, the stone demands it." Before Emma could ask more, Sarah closed her eyes and began chanting softly under her breath, her voice growing louder with each word. Emma had no idea what the words meant, but they carried a strange, otherworldly weight, as though they were part of a language forgotten by time. The wraith howled, a shrill sound that echoed through the trees, and Emma could see its icy form beginning to flicker and distort as though the ritual was having an effect. The air around them seemed to crackle, and the temperature dropped so much that Emma's breath turned to mist. The forest groaned under the weight of the ritual, as though it was fighting back. The wraith screeched in fury, its eyes glowing brighter, its form writhing and twisting in the cold air. It reached out a frozen hand, trying to grab Emma, but Sarah stepped forward, her voice steady despite the fear. "No, you will not take." Emma could feel the pull of the wraith's cold presence, trying to drag her toward it. It whispered to her, promising endless ice and eternal darkness. But Emma knew she had to fight. She wasn't going to let the wraith win, not after everything she had been through. The ground beneath them shook, and the wraith's form began to break apart. The ritual was working, but it wasn't enough. Something was missing. Emma glanced down at the stone in Sarah's hands. The runes were glowing more brightly now, but Sarah wasn't finished. The wraith lunged forward, its icy claws almost touching Emma's skin, but just before it could make contact, Emma grabbed Sarah's hand. "Sarah," Emma screamed, "we need to finish it, the sacrifice. What do we have to do?" Sarah's voice was strained, but she didn't break her focus. "The sacrifice. It has to be blood. One of Ua." Emma felt her stomach drop. The blood of the living was required, a life for a life. The wraith howled again, its form snapping back into place, its mouth opening wide, teeth like jagged ice glinting in the dark. It was preparing to strike. "Do it, Emma," Sarah cried, her voice desperate. "You have to finish the ritual now." In that moment, Emma realized what had to be done. She wasn't just fighting for her life. She was fighting for the town, for everyone who had been taken by the wraith before her. With trembling hands, she pulled out a small knife that Sarah had left on the ground and, without thinking, pressed it against her palm. Blood spilled onto the stone. The instant it touched the surface, the entire forest seemed to freeze. The wraith screamed, its form dissipating in a whirl of ice and snow, its tortured howls fading into nothingness. The snow fell gently around them, as if nothing had happened. The forest was still, the eerie presence of the wraith completely gone. Emma's legs gave way, and she collapsed to her knees in the snow, her heart still pounding. Sarah fell beside her, exhausted but alive. She looked at Emma with a mixture of relief and sorrow. "We did it," Sarah whispered, her voice soft. "The wraith is gone. It won't hurt anyone again." Emma looked around at the quiet forest, the wind now calm, the chill no longer unbearable. It was over, the curse had been broken, and Frosthaven was safe. For now. But as they made their way back toward the town, Emma couldn't shake the feeling that something still lingered in the shadows, watching them from the trees. She didn't know if the wraith would ever truly be gone. After all, evil never stayed defeated for long. The snow fell gently around them, as if nothing had happened. The forest was still, the eerie presence of the wraith completely gone. Emma's legs gave way, and she collapsed to her knees in the snow, her heart still pounding. Sarah fell beside her, exhausted but alive. She looked at Emma with a mixture of relief and sorrow. "We did it," Sarah whispered, her voice soft. "The wraith is gone. It won't hurt anyone again." Emma looked around at the quiet forest, the wind now calm, the chill no longer unbearable. It was over. The curse had been broken, and Frosthaven was safe. For now. But as they made their way back toward the town, Emma couldn't shake the feeling that something still lingered in the shadows, watching them from the trees. She didn't know if the wraith would ever truly be gone. After all, evil never stayed defeated for long. Sarah had always wanted to escape the chaos of city life. So, when she read about a small, remote village hidden in the mountains, she thought it was the perfect place to clear her mind. The winter storm was fierce as she arrived at the village late in the evening, her car's tires crunching on the snow-covered road. The wind howled around her, and the landscape looked like something out of a ghost story, silent, cold, and bleak. The innkeeper greeted her warmly, though his eyes seemed to flicker nervously when she asked about the village's history. He only said, "You'll get used to it." With no other option, Sarah took a room for the night and tried to get some rest. But sleep didn't come easily. The howling wind outside was unnerving, and strange noises crept from the walls of her room. A soft whisper filled the air, though she couldn't make out the words. Sarah chalked it up to the wind or her imagination. The next day, Sarah woke up early, eager to explore the village. The streets were empty, with only the occasional villager passing by giving her quiet nods. The snowstorm had intensified, blanketing the ground in a thick layer of white. In the village square, she met a man who appeared to be a traveler, much like herself. His name was Jonah, and he seemed wary of her questions. When she asked him about the storm, he hesitated. "Best to stay inside tonight," he said in a low voice. "The winds bring more than snow. They bring whispers." "Whispers?" Sarah asked, confused. Jonah looked around before lowering his voice. "People around here have their stories. Don't trust the forest. Don't go out when it's dark." Sarah didn't understand, but she thanked him and left. She returned to the inn, feeling a strange chill settle in her bones. That night, as the wind grew louder, the whispers returned, now clearer than before. They seemed to call her name. At first, Sarah thought she was dreaming, but when she opened her eyes, she saw shadows moving outside the window. The next morning, Sarah was unsettled, but tried to go on with her day. She found the villagers even more distant, as though they were avoiding her. It was only when she crossed paths with Jonah again that she learned the truth. "The village is cursed," he told her gravely. "Long ago, the people made a pact with the spirits of the forest. Every year someone must be sacrificed. If we don't, the spirits come for us all." Sarah frowned, not knowing whether to laugh or be scared. "That's absurd," she said. "Spirits? Sacrifices?" Jonah looked her in the eye, his expression serious. "You don't know what they're capable of. Stay inside, or you might become the next one." That evening, the wind howled louder than ever. The snowstorm outside turned into a blizzard, making it impossible to see anything beyond the window. But in the stillness of the night, Sarah heard something disturbing, a faint scratching sound at her door. Heart pounding, she opened it to find no one there, but a set of strange footprints in the snow outside her room. They were leading toward the forest. The next morning, a villager was gone. No one had heard a thing, but everyone seemed oddly calm. A few days passed, and another villager disappeared, leaving nothing but a trail of strange marks in the snow. Sarah's curiosity led her to search for answers. She found an old journal hidden beneath the floorboards of her room. It belonged to the innkeeper's grandfather. The journal spoke of an ancient pact made by the villagers to keep the forest spirits at bay. Every year, one person had to be sacrificed, and in return, the village would be protected from storms and misfortune. The villagers were too terrified to leave the village, knowing the spirits would come for them if they broke the pact. The sacrifices were inevitable, and each year, one person was chosen. The next night, Sarah couldn't sleep. The wind was so loud, it felt like the walls of the inn were going to collapse. And then, she heard the whispers again, this time, louder and more insistent. They weren't just calling her name, they were urging her to come outside. The snow had stopped, and the moonlight cast eerie shadows across the forest. Despite her fear, Sarah opened the door and stepped outside. The cold hit her like a slap in the face, but she couldn't turn back. She followed the whispers, drawn toward the edge of the forest. As she walked deeper into the trees, the air grew colder, and the shadows seemed to move around her. Suddenly, a figure appeared in front of her, a ghostly shape with hollow eyes. "It's time," the figure whispered. "You must join us." The villagers found Sarah the next morning, frozen in the snow, her body stiff and lifeless. They didn't seem surprised. Another sacrifice had been claimed by the whispering ones. The village returned to normal, and the snowstorm cleared. Life went on, and another year passed. But every year, the whispers would return, calling to the next person who arrived in the village, and the cycle would begin again.